Hello, everybody. This is Kiara Yates. I'm not Nicole Soto. I'm sitting in for her. And we're going to start with the webinar for ECHO 201, which is microeconomics. We're going to go over the additional requirements for the final project. All these weeks you have worked on your milestones, milestone 1, 2, and 3. You have completed them and you've put everything together to make your final. Now, for your final to get a full A and be 100%, you have to meet the additional exemplary category. So if you were proficient, look at your instructor's feedback. The feedback should or include that you were all set for the final, you already met the exemplary category. I specified in my feedback, so my students know that there's parts of their milestones that they don't need to touch. If your instructor has not been so specific, it's okay. Send them an email, ask them to provide you additional feedback to make sure which parts you have to work on or not, if you were proficient in all your parts and nothing was specified. To be exemplary in the final, you just need to go the extra step. So if you covered all the requirements to be proficient, it just requires you to add a few graphs in some elements, to add a little bit more analysis in other elements so that you can just go above what was required by the milestones. Starting from the beginning, the first milestone, you worked on the introduction. And when you introduce the company to be exemplary, you would use industry-specific language to establish your expertise. Remember, you're going to be a consultant for the company, and you are doing a research to establish, the market position of your company, the strengths, how demand and supply trends are, what the price elasticity is, and then you are going to provide some recommendations. So in your introduction, you want to use your industry-specific language to show that you are an expert of that industry. So it's not a microeconomic necessarily specific language, which that is also useful, but industry-specific language. And that you can acquire just by using the website of the company, their history, and just using more technical terms. When you also provided the history of your company, the choice of the company is well suited to the analysis. That means just that you chose a company that will allow you to carry on the whole final, right? If you find a company that doesn't, say you chose a company that was not quoted, which hopefully you didn't, since your instructor would have should have told you not to use that, or you have a company where you had difficulty finding information, then you wouldn't be able to complete the final. So if the company is well suited for the analysis and you explain in the history, how you're going to conduct your analysis, then you're all set and you'll be exemplary. Being exemplary in milestone 1 is fairly easy in the sense that you probably were all exemplary just by, even if you were proficient, you were already exemplary, because you might have already used the industry specific language and you might have already explained, your choice of company. When we're moving on, you had to evaluate demand and supply trends over time. Now, really important, the trends over time go over a period of 5 years. You need to go over 5 years of time to establish a trend, because obviously 1 year, 2 years don't really give you an idea of how demand and supply might have fluctuated for your company. To be exemplary, you explain in details the reasons for the trend. So you don't just want to show that demand has gone up and down or supply has changed, but why have they changed? Why has demand fluctuated? Has it fluctuated because there were price changes for your product? Has it fluctuated because supply had changes? Like, for example, the cost of inputs changed, which affected supply and then eventually migrated onto the demand side. So why were there demand and supply trends? Why were there changes in demand and supply? And then in the second part of the conditions, you want to provide concrete examples. So for Starbucks, if you start talking about an increase in the price of coffee, of the prime commodity that Starbucks purchases to make coffee, you would provide an example. Maybe they had a bad year because coffee growth, the harvest didn't go well for the coffee, and coffee increased. That caused a change in supply because they had to maybe they had to increase the cost of getting the coffee increased to change supply. It changed the prices of the coffee, which caused changes in demand within time. So the other thing you can do to provide concrete examples is also use the determinants of supply and demand. If you go through the determinants, like availability of substitutes, for example, which is the prime or complements, even if there were changes in complements. If you go through the determinants of supply and demand, then you can also provide more easily a concrete example of why, and you can find more details for the reasons of the trend. Go through the determinants, make sure you explained all 5 determinants of supply and demand, because that will help you be exemplary also. As we move on to the second part of milestone 2 was the examination of price elasticity. And you had really 3 areas of price elasticity that you analyzed. You were analyzing the data to justify how you determine that the product your company is selling or the service is providing was price elastic. So you found the data, and it says uses the research to illustrate your claims. Well, you should already have that research available, because if you found the data, you researched it. So use that research to explain even more, even better, how you justify the price elasticity of demand for your firm, for your product. The consumer responsiveness, you review all the factors of elasticity. So if in milestone 2, for example, you provided only 3 determinants of elasticity, you went over only 3 of them, or 4 of them. You probably were proficient, and you got a proficient, but to be exemplary, you have to go over all 5 determinants of price elasticity to explain consumer responsiveness. The price elasticity of demand, the pricing decisions, to be exemplary in that category, you use the research to illustrate your claims again. So for price elasticity, in 2 instances, you want to make sure that you show that you researched why you determine the price elasticity of demand of your product, how you determined it, how it affects pricing decisions for your firm, and in both instances, you want to illustrate your claims. You want to provide a concrete example. It's just another way to say that you want to provide a concrete example. And that was the end of milestone 2. That's how that becomes exemplary. And we move on to milestone 3, which was a little longer, obviously, because you had to go through cost of production, determine the market, and also provide your recommendations. For the cost of productions, again, you want to provide concrete example and substantiate your claims. What does it mean to substantiate your claims? It means that you are going to provide sources and examples, cited examples from sources that support your claim on the costs of production. So in this case, you analyze the costs of the firm, their trends over time, and how they impacted the firm's profitability. And so you want to provide an example of the trends. Again, the trends go over 5 years. So in this instance, you're going to show 5 years of trends to establish a trend. In the second element of costs of production, you're going to provide insight into how the firm can manage those costs. So you've made a differentiation between variable and fixed costs, and you've analyzed them for the firm to be proficient. You want to go a step above, and you want to provide, how can the company manage, for example, the fixed cost? The fixed cost can be really high and can hinder profitability more than the variable costs for sometimes. So how can the company manage those costs? I know for Tesla, for example, there was a change in the factory location and organization, which reduced their costs. I don't remember the exact details of where they moved it from, but that was a way to manage their costs, their fixed costs. And so if you find that example, you can use that example if you're studying Tesla. The last, once you've gone over the cost of production, you're going to go over the overall market. And with the overall market, you were first going to discuss the market share of the firm. Remember, so you were going to identify the top competitors, how many other competition there is, and where does your firm stand? How much market share did it have? So to be exemplary in this case, and most of you might already be exemplary because you might have already used the graph, you show the data graphically and over time. In the case of the market share, the recommendation would also be 5 years. You might not find market share over 5 years. As long as you show over time, if you can show like 2 years or even 3 years, that will suffice, because in this case, you're not trying to establish a trend. You're just trying to show how the market share might have changed in the last couple of years. Barriers to entry. You've gone over the barriers to entry. What are the main barriers to entries to your firm? Sometimes there'll be like economies of scale. Regulation can be a barrier to entry, especially in natural monopolies like trying to enter the utilities or telecommunications. There might be regulations that might prevent entry into the market. And product differentiation. Product differentiation can be really important barrier to entry, for example, in a monopolistically competitive market, because all the products are very similar and they differentiate themselves for small features, or they differentiate themselves for branding. Branding can be really a strong barrier to entry. So in this case, to be exemplary, you also want to provide an example of successful or failed entrance into the market. So once you've established who your competition is, you can see if there's companies that have tried to access the market, maybe lasted a year, 2 years, 5 years, but then quit because they couldn't make it, or some that entered and made it. Under Armour, for example, is a great example of a successful entry into the market. So if you're studying Nike, or even if you're researching Under Armour is a good example of success. It's a company that has a very small market share. It's got its little niche, but it's competitive. It can stay in the market. It's sustainable. And it's just, it made it despite there were such big brands to compete against. So that would be for the barriers to entries. And for the market structure. You have established a market structure, right? So you've decided that your firm operates probably in an oligopoly or a monopolistic competitions, which are probably the two most common and likely market structures for most of the firms you would be researching. And in this case, you provide specific examples to demonstrate the market structure and the firm's influence. You need to know what the firm's influence in your market is, because that is what will help you determine your recommendations for the firm, right? So if your firm has a strong market share, can impact prices, for example, can influence trends within the market, that will also reflect in your recommendations. So you want to show an example of this. And the example can be if your firm establishes trends, for example. If you are researching Starbucks again, which is always the most one that comes to mind to me. If Starbucks, say, starts producing the pumpkin spice, right? They were probably one of the first ones to introduce the pumpkin spice, and then right after them, Dunkin' Donuts started offering it, and maybe right after McDonald's. But that Starbucks established that trend. That shows the firm's influence in its market. If something they do gets copied, that is a form of influence in the market. And you need to provide examples of that, because that would also validate the market structure of your firm. And finally, in milestone 3, you provided recommendations. So you provided recommendations for future production. How can the firm manage the future production with the data that you have presented? For example, if you have identified declining demand that is more recent, then what kind of recommendation are you going to give to your firm for future production to become competitive or stay competitive within its market? To be exemplary, you will be using economic principles that you read in your textbook, and you will be applying it to those recommendations. What you learned from the textbook needs to apply to the recommendation you made. Recommended action, you provide advice for how to strengthen the position in the market. So first, in milestone 3, you recommended the action of how can the firm maintain its position of the market? What is the firm's position in the market? And then you want to say, how can it become even more powerful in the market? So if your firm is not one of the leading competitors in the market, but comes second, third, fourth, how can it build up to that? Under Armour is not a leading competitor. It doesn't have one of the biggest market shares, but it's a very competitive firm. How could Under Armour expand its market share, for example? And you can do some research on that. You can do some research on trends within that market. You can do some research on news articles where maybe some journalist who writes economic articles might have provided some ideas on companies and what they could do and what not. And you can substantiate it as long as you cite it. You can even take a suggestion from other articles you found. And just make make it your own, reword it and add your own, applying what you've researched, obviously, because every recommendation you make is going to be based on your research. So you can't do a research that points in one direction, give a recommendation in completely the opposite direction. How are you going to support it, right? The last recommendation you're going to do is how can the firm sustain its success going forward? So here you were discussing the demand trends and the price elasticity of demand and how they impact the future success of your firm. And you provide, to be exemplary, you will provide specific ideas of how the firm can sustain its success. So here, you can't go wrong on this last recommendation in the sense that there isn't a right or a wrong answer of your specific ideas, because it's ideas, right? But your ideas should be based on the demand trends you observed, on the price elasticity and the determinants of price elasticity that you have observed and how they impact the price elasticity of your product. Again, if your research points in a direction where the idea makes sense, that's a good idea. If you throw an idea that is totally off ball, or an idea that has already been implemented, it might already exist. You want to provide some fresh ideas for your company. What would you think if you were the owner of that company? If you worked for that company, what would you do to improve its success? And pretend that you are a consultant and they are waiting for your opinion about it. So provide that opinion. Lastly, to be exemplary, you will have to accurately spell check, grammar check. And when we do grammar, we do syntax. Do your sentences make sense? Is your final organized? So is your thought flowing well from element to element, or is it very choppy? Is it difficult to follow? Make sure your references follow APA formatting, but they don't just follow APA formatting. Make sure the information in it is correct. If there is an author for an article, then you need to mention that author. If you don't have a date, then you don't have a date. But if there is an author, it needs to be mentioned. You can't just use the title of the article because you didn't want to scroll all the way to the end to find out the name of the author. So make sure that you find your information if it's available, and then you use it in your references, and then on how you format those references, that is what you will put in your citations. Now, just putting random citations in the paper doesn't work. This is the issues I've had this week with some of my students, is they cited their website after one sentence, and then the rest of the paragraph didn't contain a citation, but they referred to that first source they cited. Well, that's not okay, because I don't know, once you've cited, whatever comes after is not related to that citation anymore, right? It's related to a new source, or it's just something you have elaborated yourself. Whatever comes before your citation, that is included in that citation, if we're talking of a sentence or a paragraph. So make sure you cite. You can cite every sentence if you want to. You can cite at the end of a short paragraph. I mean, that is entirely up to you, and it depends on the source and how you're using it. If you have quoted, if you're taking word by word, put quotations. If you're not taking word by word and you're paraphrasing, you would not use the quotation marks. So just make sure that you know your essay is all correct, and you'll be exemplary for the articulation of response. Follow the standards, and you'll be fine. And this is all you have to do to be exemplary. Most of you are probably already exemplary from the milestones, I imagine. And you might just have to tweak some of the elements, not all of them. You might not have to rework all of them. If needs improvement, your feedback should indicate what you need to do to improve. Make sure that if you need improvement, that you follow well the feedback. If you need improvement on that element, you practically were not sufficient on it. On that element, because of this extra category of exemplary, if you had say all needs improvements, you would not get 60% on the final assignment, because the needs improvement category is below the the 60% points. So you want to make sure that you try and at least aim for the proficiency, and then if you can do exemplary, even better. Does anybody have questions? Is the paragraphs with the recommendation? Yes, Lily, that is the conclusions. So you do all your research, and the recommendations are based on your research, so they're the conclusions. You're welcome. Does anybody else have questions? If you even have some questions on the milestones with the feedback you received, we have a few minutes, we can answer them. Even if it's not strictly about the exemplary element, we can go over a few questions regarding the content in general. I just want to make sure that you really do your best with the final, and you get the most out of it. So research articles about your firm that could be more current, more up to date. Don't just focus only on the website and on the the financial reports are fundamental to develop this. But what would be pro data? What do you mean with pro data display, Anna? I'm not sure what you mean with your question. What are you referring to? If you want to know how you would display the data, is like show a graph or a table. Best detail of data from milestone 2. So milestone 2 was the conditions. Oh, to show the trends. To show the trends, you would show sales figures. So you can go on your financial reports and examine the sales figures. I would also read the notes of the financial reports and see if there were changes to their pricing or changes in their production, because that would show the trends in the supply. The detail of data, I mean, if you say you put the sales figures for the past 5 years, that would show demand trend, your demand trends. I mean, and really the sales figure would only be like, you can be a yearly sales figures, for example. So Leanna's asking, for the final paper, do we use the paragraph headings? Example recommendation for you. You can or you cannot. Leanna, it's really up to you. I have some students who do. They have introduction, then they'll write costs of production, for example. Then they'll have a paragraph called price elasticity. They'll have another one for market, and then they'll have one for recommendations. It is entirely up to you because the paragraphs are acceptable. So you can make it in paragraphs, or you can, I wouldn't make a paragraph for each element of the rubric because that would really break it down a lot. You can make a purpose and history maybe, but then after that, I would just make paragraphs for more generic. John is asking, when embedding a graph in the paper, is it okay to cite the source of the graph directly underneath the graph? Yes. First of all, you're going to cite it directly underneath the graph, and then I think that's the only place you really need to cite it. You can put it in the references too. You might have had other information that you got from that website. I don't usually see them referenced at the end. I just see them cited under the graph. But you might also want to check with your instructor to what level of accuracy they prefer. But yes, you would definitely cite the source of the graph under the graph. And when you cite it, I wouldn't put the website. Like a lot of students put the web link, just a link, but you would cite it to say maybe Fred and a year, or I don't know. Like, well, Fred wouldn't be one that you would be using for microeconomics, but if it's the website of the firm, just write the name of the website, like not the link. And then if you want to provide the link, you can do that in the references. See figure 1 in the body of the paper. Yes. So what you would do if you also write see figure 1, then you would write figure 1 under the graph, and then you can write where you got it from. Like you basically give it a title, and the title can be an indication of your source. You're welcome. But you definitely want to indicate figure 1, for example, otherwise you wouldn't know where you're going. We've got 2 more minutes before we switch to macroeconomics. So if you have any questions, this would be the right time to ask it. And then we're going to move on to Echo 202 and macro in just a few minutes. Oh, you're welcome, Leanna. It looks like everybody's had it. I mean, this the exemplary is really just a little bit more information. Always use the graphs and the tables to provide data if you can, and then you can't go wrong because some of the elements require the more to illustrate the claims, and illustrating the claim is to provide a concrete example, and sometimes illustrating it even with the data like tables or a graph, that can always help. So if you provide concrete examples whenever you can, you're pretty much covering all the bases of the exemplary category for the final in microeconomics. And the recommendation, it just wants you to provide to support them better. Make sure your recommendations are supported by the data you found. You can find sources that might support it for you. You might read. I can never stress enough, read the note from the financial reports, because in the notes at the bottom there is all the things that the board of directors have discussed on how to further the company, how to grow, how to have more success. So if you read those notes, they really provide a lot of information that you can use in your recommendations for the firm. Sometimes they can illustrate the conditions of the firm and the situation much better than the actual numbers do. because the numbers are numbers. You might see a decline in demand and decline in sales, but then the notes might explain something that gives it a different light and a different perspective. I translate financial reports regularly, and I mean, the notes are always the most interesting part of them, I can assure you. So they're the ones that provide the most insight on the firms. So it's 9 o'clock. I'm going to shut down Echo 201 and we're going to progress to move on to Echo 202. Thank you all for attending microeconomics and welcome to all those attending macroeconomics. Oh, good night, Irene. You're welcome. So I'm going to change the document. And let me see, Echo 202. Let me see if I can open the correct one. Perfect. So welcome, macroeconomic students. We are going to go over the requirements of the final. Hi, Crystal. You're welcome. We're going to go over the requirements of the final to make sure that you can be exemplary. In the final of the macroeconomics assignment, there is an extra category in the rubric that you need to follow to be exemplary and get 100% on your assignment. Hi, Richard. And so most of you might have already been proficient, which is fine. Review your feedback, see if your instructor has by any chance told you if you're already exemplary for the purpose of the final, or if you need to add something to your slides to be exemplary in the final. We will go over all the requirements and we will also go over the additional slides you have to develop for the final. Do not forget the additional slides required for the final because a missing slide is a really big cut on the grade. It makes a big difference. Hi, Yolan. Starting from the beginning, from milestone 1, you have developed, you have researched gross domestic product, unemployment, inflation, and interest rates. You have established their trends. You have used graphs to establish those trends, and in the speaker notes, you have explained those trends, correct? You have analyzed them. So now you're proficient, you need to be exemplary. For the GDP, you have to explain the relevance of the growth rates observed. Why is it important to observe those growth rates? Why were they important for those decades? Why was the growth important? Why was the decline important? So you want to make sure that you explain the relevance. Basically, you're just giving a more in-depth sight of the analysis of the annual GDP and the growth rates. You're just adding additional information. Same thing for the events that impacted GDP and growth, national output. You want to provide an additional insight into the relationship between events and national output. If you have not used economic principles yet to make that connection, then this would be the time to use them to provide that nuanced insight, additional connection between the events and the impact on the national output. Moving on to unemployment and inflation. To be exemplary for unemployment and inflation, first of all, you need to show how the data is collected and calculated. So if you say explained that how unemployment was calculated, that it was, the labor force compared to who's actually working, no. You want to show how it is collected. How is the data collected for unemployment? There is a monthly survey. People get on the phone and call 20,000 families, households, and they ask literally a set of questions that find out who's working, who's not working, who's discouraged worker, who's decided not to work anymore. Someone went from becoming an worker to a housewife. Someone decided to go from housewife to being employed. And they ask all these questions, and every month they determine the unemployment rate for that month. You can find this information on the Bureau of Labor Statistics website. there is a page where it explains in very simple terms and very easily how the data is collected to calculate unemployment. When it comes to inflation, inflation is derived from the CPI, from the Consumer Price Index. So what you're going to be looking for is how is the data collected to calculate the consumer price, to determine the Consumer Price Index. How do they determine the basket of goods they're going to use? How do they collect the data, the pricing data for that basket of goods that is then converted into the inflation? Unemployment and events, you're going to do the same thing that you did with the national output. You're going to provide a more nuanced insight on how the events impacted unemployment and inflation. What is the relationship? If you have not used economic principles yet, this would be an opportunity to integrate economic principles to show that you really understand it and be exemplary for this category. The last element of milestone 1 was the interest rates fluctuations. You identified interest rate trends and you explained in the speaker notes how the changes in interest rates would affect other factors of the economy. How would they affect investment? How does it affect foreign trade? How does it affect GDP? Now, to be exemplary, you want to go beyond the 4 elements that it lists in the rubric. So you want to identify other factors of the economy that might have been affected by interest rate and explain how those fluctuations affected those other factors of the economy. This is where we get to 2 new slides. Once you've gone through milestone 1, you made sure you are exemplary, you've improved your speaker notes. You shouldn't have to touch the slides to be exemplary for the milestone 1. If your slides were built correctly the first time, you should just be developing the speaker notes with a little more depth. But the slides, if they contained a graph of growth, unemployment, inflation, and interest rates graphs, that should be sufficient. The speaker notes are where you're going to develop your analysis and where you're going to give that extra humph that you need to be exemplary. Then you need to create 2 more slides. You're going to develop an analysis on foreign trade. You've already done this work during module 6. And if you worked on the discussion question, because during the discussion question you had to answer some questions regarding trade restrictions during your decade. So you've probably already researched imports and exports for your decade. Find 2 charts that illustrate import and exports for your decade, giving you some numbers, because you need to analyze the data into the speaker notes and explain any fluctuations in imports and exports during your decade. So you accurately analyze the data, and to be exemplary, you will provide specific detail in presenting that data. So you will explain in your speaker notes the data that you're observing from the charts. In the second slide that you will be developing on foreign trade, you will applying specific models, economic models that you studied, to demonstrate how the domestic and foreign events have impacted import and exports for the U.S. So when we're talking events that happen in the U.S., but also events that could have happened somewhere else in the world. Crystal, depending on your decade, import and exports, you should be able to find them. You might find on the Fred website. You can go look in the Shapiro Library. You can do some research in the Shapiro Library to find them, or you can generally Google them. And sometimes there's website like Statista that might have some charts regarding import and exports in your decade. I would start from Fred though. Yeah, Fred is the first source I would ever use to find charts. And then if they don't have it, I would go elsewhere. You're welcome. So in the second slide of foreign trade, you'll be applying the model. It's a little bit like the slides you did for GDP, unemployment, and inflation, where you're identifying events that impacted the economy, and in this case, the events that impacted import and exports. If you're doing, for example, 80s through the 90s, there was the end of the Cold War. The 90s saw a change in the global markets because Eastern Europe and Russia were not part of the global markets until the fall of communism. And how did that impact import and exports, for example? Yes, thank you, Dara. They do have a link in the outline. If you follow, if you get the sample final. It's got all the links in there that help you with finding all the information you need. Once you have created your slides on foreign trade, you can go back to milestone 2. Milestone 2 and milestone 3 are going to be the same in terms of identifying what you need to do to be exemplary. Most importantly, in the first 2 elements of milestone 2 and milestone 3, so the first element, you were examining the policies from the past that carried into your decade and impacted the beginning of your decade. Why did the 80s start with high inflation? Yes, there were some historical event that affected it, but there was also a failure of the fiscal and monetary policies to improve unemployment and to reduce inflation, right? So identify those policies. You can say, well, these are the policies they implemented in the 70s. They did not work, and the 80s started with really high inflation, for example. To be exemplary for these slides, in the speaker notes, you need to cite scholarly research to support the relation between the policies and the issues. So you've already established the relations between the policies and the issues, but you might have forgotten to cite your sources, for example. So you might actually already have done the scholarly research and you simply didn't cite it. Make sure you cite your sources, especially in the slides on monetary and fiscal policies, because you need to support the relation between policies and issues. And how do you support it? You support it by showing that you researched it. How do you know that you researched it? Because you cited your sources. You refer to them in your writing. So this applies to fiscal policies from the past and to the fiscal policy actions of your decade. When you get to the impact, citing the sources, you always have to cite them to be exemplary for the articulation of response. However, that will not make you exemplary for the impact, because in this case, you just want to have concrete examples to substantiate the claims and describe the policy results. So the best way to provide concrete examples is to really develop well the part where you explain how individual households and businesses were affected by the policies. If you have policies of changes of interest rates, for example, how do you think businesses were affected? If interest rates go higher, do you think the businesses are going to invest as much? Loans are going to be more expensive, right? So they might not invest as much. If taxes are raised or taxes are reduced, how is that going to, not only how does it impact the economy as a whole, but how does it impact businesses and individual households, families? How would they be impacted? Is their purchasing power increased, or is their purchasing power decreased? And then you can provide a concrete example of the impact of these. So I would focus a concrete example on the changes in behavior of the households and the businesses. If you find concrete examples about other type, that is also really good. Of the economy in general, of how the government might have changed something, and you provide an example of that, that is also fine. But you've already had to explain how those 2 players have changed their behavior. So you might, if you provide an example or you just go into more depth, you're going to be sure you're going to be exemplary. The same approach you're going to use for the monetary policies. For the monetary policies, when you're examining the policies from the past, you have to cite your scholarly research to support the relationship between the policies and the issues. You identified the policies, what issue were they trying to address, how they impact the beginning of your decade. Cite your sources. You've done the research, use it. Don't forget to cite your sources, because that can cost you an exemplary, or that can be a proficient instead of an exemplary. And the same thing you're going to do when you examine the monetary policy actions from your decade. You are going to make sure that you cite your scholarly research and you provide examples that you have drawn from your research. When you explain the impact of the monetary policies, you want to describe the policy results and use concrete examples to support the policy results. So if the monetary policies helped reduce inflation, were successful in that. They were successful in controlling unemployment. Then how did we see this impact? You don't want to just know the numbers. Okay, the numbers improved, but how do we know they, how do you see it, that the impact of those policies? Anna is asking, for both the fiscal and monetary sections, we should start with the information from the prior decade and then lead into the decade we have selected. That is correct. Basically, what you're doing with the first slide is you're framing your decade. You're providing a background. It's actually quite coincidental. The 80s started with the high inflation. The 90s started with a brief recession. The 2000s started with a brief recession. It's a coincidence, but every decade started with something going on. So why did that happen? For the 90s, the 2000 brief recession was caused by events. But, you can also use the policies from the 90s that led into the 2000. And, there was a massive economic growth that maybe was not sustainable at the beginning of the 2000s. And so the technology bubble just made the economy go into a recession. So once you've tweaked your fiscal policy and monetary policy slides, you can move on and finally provide your conclusions, which are necessary to get an exemplary grade in your final presentation. Now, with the conclusions, I notice some students only write them in the slide and do not fill in speaker notes just because, you feel they should be there. I don't, if the conclusions are relevant to me and they're well developed, I do not penalize for not writing them in the speaker notes. But you should really make sure you verify with your instructor, because the speaker notes per the rubric should always be developed. So you could write, the first part of your conclusion is trends and outcomes. You might just want to put some key concepts in the slide and then develop an essay-like conclusion in the bottom. The first slide on the conclusion, you have to summarize the overall trends and outcomes of the 10-year period. So just summarizing is not just providing a paragraph that summarizes the decade. You have to integrate data, you have to integrate economic models and historical analysis. So basically, when you provide your summary, you need to use the information you researched throughout the course. You integrate the data, mention. So if you're doing the 2000s and you're summarizing the trends of the 2000s, mention at the recession, how far did the GDP drop, for example? How much did growth drop? Use that data, integrate it in your summary, use the economic models. So if there was a policy that was implemented and the scope of it was to increase aggregate demand, focus on, then use that information that you understood by relating what you researched to what you read and use it in your summary to be exemplary. Crystal, for the foreign trade, you don't have to go back to the previous decade. For foreign trade, you have to analyze the import and export of your decade. And when we're talking of policies, they could be more included in the events that impacted foreign trade. For example, in the 90s, you had NAFTA. You could mention it because that changed the import and exports for the US. It might have made, what impact did they have on the import and exports for the US since it changed the trade relations with Canada and Mexico, for example. Yeah, the trade agreements. You wouldn't use policy, there's no fiscal and monetary policies could have affected trade, but trade agreements in addition to events, though. I wouldn't just do trade agreements, I would also find events. For this trade, I would say minimum 2 slides, because you want one slide where you discuss import and exports. So you might have 2 charts on the slide, one to show import and one to show exports, or it can be a combined slide. Some students find the combined slide with import and exports on the same chart. And then you examine that, and then a second slide, which is the foreign trade models, which is you explain the impact of events and trade agreements on import and exports in the US. You had problems with fiscal policies in the 60s. Anna, there's a lot of fiscal policies in the 60s. You have the space race, which is extensive government spending. You have the war in Vietnam, which is extensive government spending, so that would be considered a fiscal policy. And Johnson had the war on poverty, so he improved and instituted, all the welfare net to help people get out of poverty. So for the 60s, there's plenty of fiscal policies you can go throughout the decade. Towards the end of the decade, the war on poverty is the most prominent one. And it's also the fiscal policies of the 60s that aggravated that. That's when the inflation started growing, and it aggravated it all. If you look on the website on the the Federal Reserve History website, it makes an overview of the policy of the high inflation starting from the 60s all the way to the 80s. And although it's the Federal Reserve website, it mentions some of the fiscal policies too that aggravated inflation during that decade. So you can get some ideas, and it could give you a starting point for your research. Mary wants to know, for the milestones previously submitted and graded, if we received a 1990, about how much more information is needed to get exemplary. Mary, your instructor should have told you that. It's just not, you could have gotten a proficient, but not be exemplary for the final. Just because you were proficient in the milestones, it doesn't mean you're automatically exemplary for the final. Your instructor should have specified that you needed additional work to be exemplary in the final. So for example, you could have examined your unemployment and inflation trends in relation to the GDP in a proficient way for the milestone, but if you did not indicate how the data is collected and calculated, you can't be exemplary in the final. So you either read through the rubric and make sure you've meet all the requirements of the exemplary column, which is the one all the way to the left, or you ask your instructor which slides, which elements you need to develop more to be exemplary. Because there is not just a one answer. Just because you were proficient, it does not guarantee that you were exemplary, unless your instructor said that the slide is developed in an exemplary way. I usually tell my student that the slide is good as is to go in the final, that it's already exemplary. I don't know what the other instructors do, so you should ask your instructor. Yes, Yolan, exactly. So you need to look at the feedback provided in each milestone. Karen, yes, the additional information needed, it would be added in the speaker notes, unless you received a specific comment regarding the slide that you didn't build it correctly or that you need to improve it. The additional information that will make you exemplary would be information you added in the speaker notes. My professor specifically announced the 90s didn't necessarily transfer to the final. Exactly, Mary. If you got 100% in your milestone, so you were proficient, it does not mean that you are exemplary for the final. You need to go read that exemplary column, and you need to make sure that you meet the requirements to be exemplary. M says, all of my feedback for improvement on my milestone said that I need to include more macroeconomic principle in my explanations. I did try to do this, so I'm wondering if you have advice or example of how I can include more. I haven't seen your milestone, so I don't know how you integrated your macroeconomic principles. But for example, when you are researching the impact of monetary and fiscal policies, you could include a chart of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and show how aggregate demand and aggregate supply might have shifted in response to the monetary and fiscal policies. So that would be a way to integrate macroeconomic principles. When you did the research on unemployment and inflation, you could have used the Phillips curve to show how in the short term, usually if unemployment is high, inflation will be low. If you did the 70s, that does not hold true. So you can use the Phillips curve to see how the model doesn't apply, for example, because you can also have constructive criticism of the model. So yes, use vocab words from the textbook. Good advice, Holly. refer to the textbook. The textbook has a lot of examples of things that happen throughout the decades that you might be able to apply into your research. So the last slide you will need on your final, and this way we can conclude this, is a slide on agreement and disagreement. We don't want to see simply, oh, I agree with all the policies, I disagree with the policies. You also have to explain why. And in this case, you would integrate your macroeconomic principle and models to explain why you agree. You might agree because economic theory says that to a certain action corresponds a reaction, right? So you agree to the fiscal policy implemented because that fiscal policy should have produced certain results, which it may or may have not, but that's what should have done. So that would have been a policy consistent with economic models. You have to support your point of view. So make sure you use, how do you support your point of view? You provide concrete examples supported by scholarly research. So you use your references, you use your sources to support your point of view. If you disagree, especially if you disagree, you can constructively disagree, but disagree constructively. You disagree because you don't think that that policy made sense. You explain why you don't think it made sense. You explain why you don't think that was the right moment to implement a certain policy, and then you can provide an example of maybe how the policy failed in the past and it failed in your decade too. There is, I mean, in general, it's difficult to tell you where you might have mentioned the macroeconomic principles, but not enough. I guess I would say when it comes to growth and explaining the relevance of the growth observed, you can use a lot of macroeconomic principles. Go in the chapters that discuss long-term growth for the book, and there you will find a lot of information on how to integrate macroeconomic principles to the growth. And like Holly said, use the vocabulary from the textbook and read the textbook. I mean, one of the features that is really interesting in the Pearson textbook is that you can research. You can just research strings of words. So you don't have to go read every single page. You could even just write 1970 and see if there's any information on the 70s or 1980 or 1990. And there will be parts of the textbook where maybe they mentioned a decade in relation to an economic principle they're trying to explain. Jen, in your conclusion, it depends. If there's a policy that was implemented towards the end of the decade, and so would have carried impact into the next decade, and you want to discuss it, then yes, you can go into the beyond your decade. So for example, if you're doing the 70s, in 1979, Volcker was nominated chairman of the Federal Reserve, and they changed their approach, their monetary policy approach, to try and fight inflation, but you only saw the effects in the 80s. You could briefly explain that, you were in favor of that policy, you were in favor of that change of approach, and explain the impact, briefly show because it was successful in the 1980s in curbing inflation, for example. That's why you would overlap in the next decade in that instance. Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome, Karen. Does anybody have any more questions? Of course, the last element to be exemplary on is the articulation of response. Please, please, please run a spell check. Run a grammar check. Make sure you have capitalized correctly. United States is always capitalized. Federal Reserve is always capitalized. If you're saying it for short, it's the Fed without the S, because the Feds with the S is the FBI. The Fed, no S, is the Federal Reserve. So make sure, I know you're all laughing, but in this case, you're trying to be exemplary, not proficient anymore. And so just make sure you have spell checked. So yes, Word does a really great grammar check, and don't discount it, because there are words that might be spelled correctly, but they're wrong in that context. For example, like there, for example, is often misspelled. Affect versus effect is often misspelled. Affect is a verb, effect is a noun. So the effect of the policy is towards this, how did the policy affect the economy, right? So the spell check won't catch it because effect, they're both spelled correctly, but the grammar check will catch it because they're used in the wrong context. Yes, affect is a verb, effect is a noun. So, there is over there as towards to their belonging to them. So you want to make sure, that your words make sense in that context. Oh, yes, and there too. Correct, Karen. That is another way to spell it that can be. So if you run the grammar check, it'll catch it. And if you have a doubt, you can always quickly do a double check. When you write your references, sometimes you think, oh, there's no author and you're tired and you don't want to scroll to the end of the page, but scroll to the end of the page. Scroll to the end of the paper. Sometimes the author can be found with a little bit more look into the website. I've had student this week use the same source, which I cannot quite remember what it was, but it was a PDF. It was an essay written by Manqui, and nobody cited him as the author. They all used the name of the website instead of the author. Well, the author was there, the date of publication was there, but for some reason, I'm sure they saw it because they had to read that PDF, but nobody used it to cite. If there is the name of the author for something, use it. Absolutely use it. Then use the title, then put the title, and then put the link to the website. And this way you can't go wrong with the references. If you are in doubt, go to the Shapiro Library. There's actually a reference and citation generator that you can access through it. Actually, you can access it through the Writing Center. If you don't know how to get to the Writing Center, just search Writing Center on your SNU page. And when you get to the Writing Center, there's a reference and citation generator. So if you're unsure, you put all the information in there. It'll ask you for the author. If you don't know it, leave it blank. It'll ask you for the web page, for the title, for the link, and it will generate it. And then all you have to do is copy and paste it in your references page. Are there any more questions regarding the final? And please, please, please do not forget the foreign trade and the conclusion slides. You have to add at least 4 slides to your final. 2 for foreign trade and 2 for conclusions. Oh, you're so welcome. If there's no more questions, we can close this session. I'm sure all of you are tired and you're looking forward to either resting or taking a look at your final. And if in doubt, please ask your instructor. If you were proficient on the milestones and you don't know if you need to work more, you read the exemplary column and you are still unsure, ask your instructor, but don't ask generically, be specific. Yes, Jen, working on the final, exactly. I'll be sitting to download this webinar. It takes the whole hour to download it before I can upload it on YouTube. Go on the, if you have questions for your instructors, be specific on which element you have the question for. Don't say in general, oh, how can I be exemplary now that I'm proficient? Go look at the column of the exemplary. Some of them are really easy to understand. If you didn't identify how the data is collected and calculated for inflation and unemployment, you can figure it out on your own. But if you have to provide a more nuanced insight on GDP and growth, maybe you're not sure if you did. And if your instructor didn't specify in the milestone, you can ask them, is this enough to be exemplary in the final? And they will answer you. We're here for that. We're here to make sure you're all successful.